Good morning, everybody. Absolutely fantastic to see so many GRC friends all gathered together after such a long time apart. So I know a lot of you guys here, but just for those of you that don't know who I am, I used to be the chairman of the GRCA, and my passion from when I became chairman has been advancing quality, which is really a passion of mine. When I was chairman, we pulled away from the GRC, from the Concrete Society, and the reason that we did that was really to sort of try and take the quality position further. That's through what at the time was the Approved Manufacturers Scheme, which was limited to very few manufacturers. But over the last 12 years, we've been able to expand that, as Simon says, and we've been able to pull it so that all members are now full members and get at least some sort of an assessment. What I want to do in this presentation is just to talk about maybe what other things that we need to do, and I'll go on and explain that. So just a bit about my company, the GRC Centre. Over the last 20 years that I've been involved in GRC, primarily in manufacturing. But what we do now, and we've set up 2 manufacturing businesses, both of which my company sold, and those companies are now 2 of the biggest producers in the UK. So this is what we do. Essentially, we try to provide help and support both to manufacturers and, importantly, specifiers and users of GRC when they're actually procuring the material and then during the actual construction. So listen, a bit of a background to this. I think anybody who's involved in GRC understands that you need a real strict approach to quality and testing. That was recognised since day one in the 1970s, a really important aspect of it. And that the manufacturing processes and procedures have to be closely followed. And these procedures and processes have been developed over the last 50 years. And they are good practices and they're good procedures. The problems that we had in the 1970s were that people were not following these processes and procedures. And I can remember, and I was just talking to a colleague from, not that long back, from 2010, when we used to go see architects in London to talk about using GRC, and they'd say, oh, we're not using that, there's a massive problem with it, and it was on a blacklist. But we've been able to move on from that, and today, GRC, as you all know, is getting used very, very widely. You only need to leave this building, and within a 5-minute walk, you're going to go to half a dozen really big GRC projects. Probably the biggest one just across the road. But even in 2010, this was just before the Olympics. It was difficult to actually find a GRC job in London. But it's now recognised as it's a standard construction material, certainly in the UK, across Europe and other parts of the world. But it is recognised as one of the most complex and materials widely used in the construction practice. And my question that I'm asking today is, are the standards that we work to, are they enough for certain applications, such as high-rise construction or really large projects? And I'm going to amplify on that as we go through the slides. I think everybody here is going to be that produces GRC is going to be producing it to one of these standards. There's the GRCA specification, which is these are all about quality control. So there's a GRCA specification, which is 17 pages. There's BSEN 1169, which is 10 pages. And then in the States, they have PCI MNL 13009, which is 180 pages. As you can see, there are quite a lot of areas that the American guys look at in terms of quality more than we do perhaps in Europe and other parts of the world. And it's important that everybody who's using GRC or is manufacturing GRC recognises that both the GRCA specification and EN 1169 are the minimum manufacturing standards for any application, irrespective of its consequence of failure risk. That means that the guy who's making some small architectural dressings to go over windows and heads in house building is producing to the same standard as somebody who's putting GRC on a 300 metre high cladding building. MNL 13009 is specifically for large spray GRC applications, and that's the reason why it is far more comprehensive in terms of the quality levels that are required. So I just want to briefly talk about the role of GRCA in quality. Not everybody within the GRCA agrees with me about this, but I'm very anxious that people understand that we are not a policing organisation. And what we should be is an educational, and we're trying to be, an educational body that can help and inform members. And gatherings like this that we don't have often enough are great for people to be able to exchange ideas and discuss the different aspects and the different problems that we all face. But we have moved it on, and we've moved it on tremendously. A lot through Simon's chairmanship, where, as he said earlier, he's managed to get a situation where everybody who is a manufacturer has to have a desktop assessment by a conformity assessment body who's appointed by the association. It's important, though, that specifiers, users and manufacturers understand that it's not a guarantee of either design or manufacturing control. It simply isn't. And it's wrong that people would draw that conclusion. And this is one of the things that I think that people really do need to understand as what we do as the GRCA. We do put that on the website. We make it quite clear what exactly a full member is. But somebody mentioned earlier about people who come in just to get the logo. That's not, people come in to get the logo to get jobs, because people assume, oh, it's a GRCA logo, it's high quality. That's not the case. Simply not the case. And I think, as Simon said, some people have not even been able to come to the sort of minimal levels that we require. So I want to just explore maybe what additional requirements both manufacturers and purchasers of GRC need to think about when they're using GRC on large projects and high-rise construction. Obviously, when you're doing that, any problem with the GRC is going to be a far, far more bigger problem than it will be in just a small application. One of the most important things that we find in manufacturing is that you've got to have some sort of quality control. Now, I think that's fairly obvious to anybody. But what is important is that the quality control manager in a GRC factory should not be working for the production management team, because there's two different objectives going on. The production team have got to get high quality GRC manufactured, but got to hit production targets, and they've got to get the stuff out of the door to produce the cash flows and things that are required. The quality manager needs to make sure that what goes out of the door is right. If you've got those two roles combined, then you have got a potential problem. So whenever we're talking to people about what should be done in the factory, that would be, you really need to have a dedicated quality control manager. And certainly, a lot of the GRC manufacturers do that. And some of them go down as far as to have individual quality managers for each spray station, which is obviously a really good system to approach. And then there's the use of independent people. I think people were talking about third-party assessments. I mean, obviously this is a bit of a selling thing for me, but I have to apologise it. To provide third-party conformity assessments, that people are making the GRC the way that it is supposed to be made. That they are compacting it and not just spraying it down without compacting it, as we talked about earlier on. And this is, as I understand it, and to be fair, I'm not going to pretend that I know an awful lot about it, but I think that's what they do within the PCI plant certification, where two of their inspectors who are experienced will literally visit plants twice a year unannounced to make sure that everything is being complied with. So that's an area that maybe people should think about, is what are we doing within quality control within the factory environment and the production environment. This, to me, is the biggest issue in the industry. This is the compatibility of the facing coat with the structural GRC. It's not covered in either the GRCA specification or BS EN 1169. It's extensively covered in the PCI document, and it's often ignored by the manufacturers. And it's certainly not understood by the specifiers and purchasers, who just think of GRC as being GRC, and they do not think that there's actually two different elements to a GRC panel. What you see and what's doing the work behind what you see. So one of the biggest issues, and I know that you'll all come across this, micro crazing and cracking in face coats. Probably the biggest thing that we get called in to look at projects about. Can you come down? We've got a problem with the GRC. It's covered in cracks, it's covered in crazing. What's causing it? What's the problem? There are lots of complicated reasons that cause cracking and crazing in GRC, but one of the causes is a differential movement between the facing coat and the structural GRC. Unless you've been able to balance those mixed designs, which often contain different aggregates, possibly sometimes people put different amounts of cement on, then you can get a differential movement. If the facing coat and the backing coat are going to expand and contract at different rates, it's going to cause crazing. It might be even worse than that and cause bowing on GRC panels, face coat contracting, pulling the panel into a bow. Could get it the other way, which causes it to crack across the face as we're talking about. I don't know where this research has come from, but again, in the PCI document, they're saying that a differential movement of 0.04% is going to start causing crazing and cracking. Now, that is a minute amount of movement. And one of the reasons that got me interested in all this was the 1170 part 7 test, which is the test, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, it's to test the movement of GRC. And I was always intrigued as to why the measuring device that we used to do it needs to be so accurate to 0.003 of a millimetre, which is engineering level. And it's because that test is also testing the facing coat. When it was written in, whenever it was, the late 90s, I don't think it was properly explained that that's what that test is doing as well as just doing the thing. So that's something that people really need to think about, what manufacturers need to think about, and what architects need to think about when they're picking colours. Because the last thing that you want is to get a colour chosen a week before, or a finish, a week before you're going into manufacture. Because with a week before going into manufacture, you've got no time to do any testing as to whether that face coat is compatible with your GRC. If the architect is saying to you, I want some more aggregate in this, or I need a bit more of this, you've no time to test it. You may have no idea what it's going to do. And so the other things that you may want to think about testing on large projects, on the face coat. So we're talking about the face coat here, not the GRC. You may be thinking about compressive strength. You may want to look at reaction to freeze-thaw cycles. You may want to look at combustion, and you may want to look at flame spread. Because we talk a lot about fire, and we talk about testing GRC. And as the GRCA, we've done tests on generic GRC. We don't do tests on face coats. And that's where the flame spread is. So that's something else that needs to be considered, which means that people need to think about projects further in advance. This is another thing that I'm really big on, I always have been big on it, and that's this increased frequency testing for the flexural strength. One of the things that I find quite amazing is that in those 3 standards that I talked about, there are requirements for what the frequency of flexural testing is, particularly at both the LOP and the MOR levels. So in 1169, you just need to do it once a year, which is mad. In the GRCA specification, you need to do it at least twice a week. In the PCI specification, you need to do it every day. And certainly, and within the GRCA specification, although we say it's at least twice a week, we do actually say this is a minimum. This is the minimum of what you should be doing. So the reality of that is that every GRC manufacturer should have a test machine and should have access to be able to do regular testing. And it's certainly what we would advise specifiers to put into a specification on large and high-rise construction projects. Fine. Okay. Density. People think it's not important. I think it's really important. People think it's not important because there's no pass or fail. What it is really useful in is looking at the consistency of the material. If you can get consistent densities, then you've probably got consistent flexural strengths. If you've got consistent flexural strengths, you've got good characteristic properties. So it assists in their manufacturing process, and it can be used to reduce manufacturing costs. Because if you're looking at how your densities are performing, maybe doing it every day, you can start looking at different things. It's a bit similar to what Benny was talking about looking at these thermocoupling ideas and things like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. My colleague Ian White's giving a full presentation on it. Embedded testings, no requirement in the European and British standards or the GRCA. With the increased use of these in fixings, you've got to think about it. As I say, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because Ian's picking up on it, yeah? This is a really interesting one. We're back to facing coats again. Facing coat thickness and possibly corresponding GRC under thickness. One of the most common things that we see in factories is people applying a facing coat and not measuring it with a pin. Apply the facing coat, they think it's whatever thickness it is, and then they put the GRC on the back and then they put the pin in it. We got to our 15 mil. When we get to our 15 mil, we find that 7 millimetre of it's face coat and the other 8's GRC. What I didn't realise until very recently, in fact preparing for this paper, is what can actually happen here is two things. When the GRC is thinner, I'm not an engineer by the way, it'll deflect more. Because it deflects more, it's putting more stress against that unreinforced face coat. So if you've got a GRC that's bending, and the face coat's not reinforced, what's it going to do? It's going to crack. So that's a really big issue that we need to think about. The other thing about it, which this graph proves, which again is colleague from Ian, is theoretically, and it is theoretical because it'll change depending on your different engineering modelling, how much the MOR requirement goes up with the thickness. You can see at an MOR of 8, you need a thickness of 18 millimetres. And you can see how it goes up. When you get to a thickness of 8 millimetres, theoretically you need 40 MPa of MOR. So I can't stress enough how much we as an industry need to start thinking about face coats and face coat thicknesses. Flexural strength testing, big bugbear of mine. We've talked about the increased frequency of flexural testing, but we test these little sample boards. These sample boards are typically 0.3 to 0.4 square metres, sprayed up a flat panel, once a day, twice a week, once a year. Guy sprays it up, compacts it, sprays it up, compacts it, goes away, gets tested. Is that representative of what's actually going into a product? Where you can have a panel that, you know, it could easily be 10 times the surface area, and it's complex geometrical shape. No longer is the guy spraying like this, he's spraying like this. No longer is he compacting down, he's compacting like that. It may even be compacting like that as well. So that's something that maybe we need to think about. Finished product testing. This is where we actually, you know, bring these things together and say, really, should we be doing an element of finished product testing to see if we've got the face coat thickness right, the structural GRC thickness right, flexural strength right? Yeah, I think we should. Now, the big issue is, of course, that it's a destructive test, which means that you've got to make a panel. A panel's got to be selected for testing. But I've tried, because I'm from a manufacturing background and I understand the commercial side of it, is I've tried to work out what the cost of testing 2.5% of your production would be against an entire GRC project. That's taking into account the design, the GRC, the steel bracketry, and the installation cost. And doing a 2.5% population test on a finished product is going to add less than 1% to the finished GRC contract value. And to me, that should be a fairly easy sell to a specifier and user. Right, I'm going to wrap this up very quickly. So just some final thoughts here that I think we need to do. Final thoughts. Growth in the GRC industry was restricted until very recently by in-service failures. Direct result of either lack of understanding of the strict quality controls or just simple cost cutting. Although the GRC has worked very hard, and we have worked hard to increase this quality issue, there's still problems and they still exist to this day. I'm getting called out every week, go look at Joe, what's wrong with this? Why has this done that? How's it done that? We're all reliant on GRC for our livelihoods. We cannot afford our industry to be affected by this again. So my message to people who are actually specifying and using this, if I just encompass it, don't rely on the full member logo for a guarantee of quality, because you haven't got it. You've got to adopt a buyer beware attitude and procure GRC from manufacturers who can demonstrate an unsurprising quality to quality control and testing. And the message that I want to leave this is, we all talk about price and how much it costs and who's the order is the cheapest. This is not a product that you can buy on price. If you buy it on price, you're generally suffering through quality. Really does matter. Yeah?